Hello everyone, I'm Imran. I'm the product manager for browsers in HyperWorks. Today, we'll be looking at what's new in HyperWorks for version 2022.3 for browsers. Before running through the features in .2, I just wanted to quickly present some of the new features that we added in 2022.2, as we didn't get a chance to present these earlier. So first up, we have added quick creation and deletion buttons in all the entity views. This kind of allows you to just click on the button, create an entity or delete an entity. And this is supported in all the entity views in the browsers. Next, we have added a rename by ID tool. This is basically would allow you to rename the entities by appending its respective IDs. And this can also be used to prefix or postfix the existing name. This kind of a panel removal, this functionality was there in the panels in the classic interface. So this is going to replace that and allow you to do a little more extra which I'm going to go and demo in a bit. Next, we have added a bool type metadata, which is newly available in the .2 version. This would allow user to add a check button as a value to the metadata that they would add. Then on the preferences side, all the browser preference options can now be set or changed using the star set option commands. Users can use this to set these preferences in advance before invoking the session. So let's quickly run through those. So first one, if we are in a main entity view, for example, here the materials, all the materials are shown. In these kind of views, clicking on this button would create an entity with a default card image. If we do that while being in a sub-entity view, for example, a specific card image, and then clicking on that button would create the entity with a card image respective to the view that you are in, so that intelligence is in. Um, for users who wanted to create multiple entities, they can just click multiple times on the button, quickly create the entities for editing and defining the attributes later on. Then they can as well pick any entity and just click on the delete button to delete the entities as well. Next, for the rename by ID, I can pick some entities. This particular tool is going to work on the selection that's done prior to invoking this. So I pick those entities and I can invoke the tool from the context menu. And by default, we have kept it to address the append case where the existing name a user would want to append the ID. So I quickly click on that, OK, and then it's going to rename or append the entity ID to the name. If I undo that and invoke this again, and if I just wanted to have the ID itself as the name, I can do that as well. Let me undo that again. And we can switch this as well. So one thing to note here is any attribute that we want to define or want the tool to pick it as an attribute would have to be defined under the square brackets. So basically, I can switch the order as well here for the name to have the ID at the start. If I undo that again, here I can as well define a prefix to start with, and then again have the ID included and then the existing name. It would rename all those selected entities with that. If I undo that again, I can also, for example, define a prefix as load collector or load case, and then I can also add a postfix for it, and then say OK. So all that will be done in one particular shot. I can do the same thing for the remaining as well. So they are in the same format. And this was just an example with the load step. This can be done with any entity type in HyperMesh. Okay. Then next for the Boolean operator, like as usual, you can either add the metadata to an existing entity from the browser context menu or from the EE. This dialog is posted. In this, you can see that we now have a new type called bool. So user can give any required name here. For example, I'm going to call it as encrypted, and then I can say either yes or no and say OK. And that metadata would be added here for that particular entity. And I can as well add it as a column, and then like with generic attribute columns, I can just click on that to define on the selected entity if it was not already there. And then I can click to activate or deactivate it. Okay. Again, this particular option is there for all the entities for which you can add the metadata. Okay. Next, for the browser preferences, if I go here, select the browser preferences, and I change some of the options, for example, these two, and I say OK, my model browser is going to rebuild to show the entities there. And once we do that, if you check the command file, you're going to see the browser options being written out there under the set option command. Now, these commands can be copied to a file called hmcustom.tcl, and a user can use this to define their preferred options as a default. And once we have this defined on the startup, HM is going to read this and automatically set the required defaults on the startup. So all those options are now supported with the star set option. Okay, with that, let me get back. Okay, before moving on to 2022.3, I wanted to make an important point that most of the development efforts and time have been put on the performance and stability and the panel removal tasks in this particular release. So you're going to see majority of the development in those areas, and with whatever time we got, we try to sneak in some of the small features in this release. First one is again related to panel removal. The display entity count in the earlier or the classic version, we had this in a panel where you could just click and find out all the displayed entities. Now we show that in the dialog. User can just invoke this dialog, and we list all the graphical entities, basically the entities that have either a direct or indirect graphics. That will be present in the dialog, and the displayed column will show the count. We also have an optional all column, so that if user wanted to compare the displayed entity count with the overall count, and maybe wanted to share it as share this information with the colleagues, they can do that. So we have that as an option, and it can be invoked via the context menu in the model browser. Next, we have opened up or supported the attribute columns for the geometric entity views. Now any data can be added as a column either via the entity editor or from the choose attribute dialog. Then the isolate entity option has now been added to the browsers. This is basically the isolate option of the classic interface. This was present in the graphics, was missing out in the browser, so we have added that, and it allows you to kind of isolate within the selected entity type, whereas the isolate does the isolate across all the entity types. I'm going to quickly show that. Then we have added an option to close all the entity views that have been opened in the session at once. This was kind of being requested for. So once you work with all the entities and you are about to close a session and you don't want to retain those entity views for the next session, you can just use this option from the model browser to close all those entity views. Let's quickly look at those. Session. So here, let me first go back and set my preferences back to default. Okay, so here, right click in the model browser, I can invoke the dialog from here. It's going to give you all the entities, even if some of the entities are not displayed in the graphics, but this is a graphical entity, so it's going to list that and going to give you the count. You can add all column as well. Then we can quickly search for the required entities. Okay. Once I do a show all here, all the entities are displayed. Now, if I again invoke the dialog, it's going to give me all the entities that are displayed plus the all count. One important point to note here is the overall count of the entities for all the entity types that the panel used to show. Now, the model browser is the replacement for that. Almost all the entities we list in the model browser as soon as a model is loaded. So if you wanted to check for the overall count, you would be directly getting that in the model browser itself. Only if you want to really look at the entities that are displayed and want to get the count for all the entities at once, you would need to go to this particular dialog. Okay, for the geometric entity attribute support, let me switch to this particular model. So here, once you go into the entity view, you have all the metadata, and you can pick any metadata and add it as a column either from the graph, either from the entity editor, or do the same from the choose attribute dialog. And once you have it, you can review the value for all of for that specific metadata for all the entities that are listed in the browser without having to select each and every entity and then look into the entity editor to find out. And once you have added that, you can as well edit those values if required. And not just for the solids, like I mentioned, it's there for all the entity views like surfaces, points, lines as well. Okay. Next, for isolate entity, let me switch back to this. Isolate my components. And let me select this particular view that I have saved. Go to the contacts view. So here, if you see, I have some of the contacts that are close by. I have a contact here and as well here. So if I wanted to just isolate this particular contact, I would pick that and use the isolate entity. So what would happen here is it'll isolate within the selected entity type. So it'll hide all the other entities and just isolate or show only the one that I have selected. This kind of keeps the other entity types like the elements, nodes, and components all intact without disturbing them, and just keeping the selected contact in the screen. So it kind of allows you to review the selected contact with in reference to the entire component or the part. The same thing if I do the isolate. So basically, this is where the name is coming from, isolate entity. It's going to isolate within the selected entity type. And this isolate is more at kind of acts at a global level across all the entities. So when you do isolate here, it's going to isolate the selected entity, but turn off all the other entity types. Okay. Then for the closing entity views, like I have all these entity views open, and if user is done with basically why we need, just a quick point here, why we push the users to work with the entity views is you can utilize the part of the attribute columns for editing, for reviewing, and we have a lot of advanced filtering options where you can work with the selected entities, displayed entities, and if you have huge number of entities, you can populate those browsers to have just the selected entities. And there's not going to dwell much into this because I've covered these in the previous webinars. So that's the reason why we kind of want the users to start using the entity views rather than having everything inside the model browser and scrolling a lot up and down. Okay, so now once you're done with done working with the entity views, we save these to the settings so that in the next session when you open, you get all these back. You don't have to reopen them, and any attribute columns that you have added, they are also saved and they are brought back. But for some reason, if you don't want that, and if you're working on a new project, you want to close all these entity views and don't want to restore them, you can just go here, close these using the option, and all those entity views will be closed, and you can now close the session and reopen. Those will not be saved. Okay, with that, let me switch back to the presentation. Some more options that we have added. An option here or a feature to delete all the preserved or free nodes from the model browser. Uh, Point to note here is when you invoke or use this particular option from the nodes folder in the model browser, it's going to delete all free nodes and all the preserved nodes that are there in the model. So it's a quick way to if you want to get rid of them all at once. But if you want to delete some of the free nodes or some of the preserved nodes, you'd have to use the context that's there in the ribbon. Then in the choose attribute dialogs for elements, we were not showing the configs earlier. So now we have added that. And if you want to add any attribute, you can now pick based on the element config and then add that to the browser. Then in the Abacus interface, under the load collectors, we have now added the subcategories. This will quickly show you how many history and initial condition load collectors that you have. Earlier, this was missing. So we have added that now. And another small feature here is to allow creation of tags from the model browser itself. So you can just right click in the model browser and pick the tags from the create menu and did the tags right away. And another feature or a small enhancement is we have now supported or added the O keyboard shortcut for organize. This was there in the graphics, was not present in the browser. So now you can just pick any entity and just hit O on the keyboard to enter the organized context with the selection being pushed to the context. And you can just pick the destination there and go from there. Okay, next up is the performance enhancements that I spoke about earlier. The major one is with the entity editor population, especially for the entities like load steps, where the references are going to be huge. The load step entity can have crazy amount of references depending on the analysis type. So if it had more number of references, we were trying to build all those, so it was taking time. Like you can see in the chart, in earlier versions like 2022, it used to take around 11 seconds, and we brought that down in .1 to around 4 seconds. And with the latest version, it's less than half a second. So you just pick an entity, it's populated in the entity editor in instance. So that's the major thing, and we have achieved this with the on-demand population of the embedded EE that I'm going to show and talk while I demo this. And other performance enhancements are done with respect to the opening and opening of elements in Nodes browsers. These were a little slow because of the attribute scanning earlier, and now they have been enhanced. And there are performance enhancement in sorting the attributes under the Nodes browser. Earlier, it used to take a lot of time if you add any attribute and try to sort it. And then if you had a lot of loads in the model, and if you right click on the loads folder in the model browser, it used to take a lot of time. So this also has been enhanced now. Let me quickly show that if I, for example, go here and pick this model, let me expand this and select this particular load step. And you can see as soon as I select that, it's posted. The difference compared to the earlier versions was in earlier version, as soon as you select an entity, we were trying to build the main entity editor data, and plus along with that, we used to build all the reference entity data as well. Whether the user was using it or not, we used to keep it ready. We don't do that anymore. Now it's on-demand population only if the user wants it and user clicks on this expander. At that time, we build the data. So user would kind of pay the penalty of a fraction of a second while he's actually clicking on the expander to see that particular data. Otherwise, they'll not see the delay while they're switching the entities on the selection in the browser. Okay, and not just for the load step entities, this has been kind of extended overall to all the other entities as well. For example, even the entities like the properties, materials that can have references. For these entities as well, we don't automatically build the reference data now. We build it on demand. So unless and until you go and expand it, the material data will not be built on the selection itself. So here also there should be uh, good performance improvement. But yeah, here it's not gonna be noticeable because you have only one reference there. So any entity that has more references that you can see. And another major difference between all these entity types and the load step is, for example, if you expand a material here in this particular case, we remember that on the parent entity that's selected. So a material is expanded when the parent entity was the property. So after this, if you select a property again anywhere, if the material is available, we are gonna keep it as expanded so that you can just switch the entity and review the reference data as well. I would say the best way for this would be to add a column and directly review it in the browser. But if somebody wanted to kind of do that while keeping the reference data expanded and switch the selection, they can do that. So this would be the behavior for all the entities except the load step. In load step case, we are going to kind of save this particular state on the entity type plus the ID. So what I mean is, for example, for the load step 4, I have the SPC expanded. Now, if I switch to load step 3, you'll see that it remains collapsed. Then I switch back to 4, it gets expanded. So this is saved on the ID for load step. And the reason for that is the labels of the references can be repetitive in the load step case. For example, I have SPC here, I have load, and if I scroll down all the way, those can be repeated again because a load step can be referenced under a load step in this case. So you can see the SPC and the load and the pretension, all having the same labels can be repeated. So if we would have tried to save this on the entity level itself, we would end up in a lot of issues because the same labels would start expanding wherever they are referenced. All of those will start expanding at once. So for that reason, for load step, it's going to be on the ID based, but overall, it's going to address the performance issue that with this kind of model, which have a lot of references used to see, uh, without losing much of the functionality. The embedded would still be there, just that the data will now be populated on demand. Okay. Next, I wanted to show the elements in Nodes browser. And now it's going to be really quick. As soon as you click on the folders, we post the browser. Since here the count is more, we post this message for you to populate it. So in this case, if I select some nodes and populate in the browser, and add my grid commit as a column, and turn some of them on. So earlier, adding any attribute to the node browser and sorting it used to take a lot of time, around 2 minutes for any attribute for the first time. So that has now been fixed. The sorting is going to be really quick. And the last one is if you have a huge number of loads in the model, right-clicking on that to bring up the context menus used to take a lot of time, and now that's been enhanced to post the context menus quickly. So overall, just for .3 version, just for browsers, there are overall around 15 enhancements and more than 230 bug fixes done in this particular release. So yeah, that should be a good reason for you guys to switch to .3 as soon as it's available. Yeah, I think that's pretty much from me for now. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, you can bring it up now.